When survival is no longer theoretical, you need to understand this. The most potent survival apparatus of World War II wasn't a weapon, a fortified shelter, or an ingenious escape strategy. It was something far less conspicuous, so commonplace that most individuals today pass by it without a second thought. Yet, this unassuming device sustained entire families when power networks collapsed, fuel supplies vanished, and global logistics crumbled instantaneously. If you grasp its operation, you'll gain a practical skill applicable even in a contemporary residence. Now, allow me to transport you back in time for a moment. Envision a winter evening in 1943. The wind seeps through the cracks of an old farmhouse. The kitchen shelves are sparsely stocked, as weekly ration coupons no longer cover as much as they did last month. A lone lamp flickers in the corner, not for ambience, but because electricity has been intermittent for weeks. In the pantry, a few burlap sacks of grain remain untouched, not because the family forgot them, but because those nutritional reserves are inaccessible due to a challenge no longer commonly discussed. This is the true beginning of survival. It doesn't commence with glamorous equipment, but with the quiet realization that your existence depends on tools that function independently of grids, engines, or fuel deliveries. Tools that operate because you operate them. And tools that transmute scarcity into security. Today, we will rediscover one such apparatus. To comprehend why this instrument was so vital, you must immerse yourself in the reality of the 1940s, a period when every system you now rely on was either precarious or non-existent. Supply vessels traversing the Atlantic were sunk without warning. Freight trains were reallocated for military purposes, causing civilian shipments to endure weeks of delays. Coal yards became depleted as fuel was redirected to factories. In numerous rural areas, particularly in North America, electricity had yet to reach the average farmhouse. Even in urban centers, blackouts became customary. Families prepared meals by candlelight and warmed water over wood stoves as modern infrastructure was strained beyond its capacity. Food, once a given, became unpredictable. This wasn't due to laziness or poor foresight, but because global logistics had simply succumbed to the pressures of war. When the established system falters, you abruptly discover that what you considered normal life was in fact a fragile chain composed of millions of interconnected components. The instant even a few of these components fail, basic survival responsibilities revert to you. Consequently, wartime families did not await rescue. They integrated resilience into their daily routines. They trusted tools that required no electricity, spare parts, or fuel. These tools performed as reliably in freezing barns and blackout kitchens as they did on a sunny day. At the core of that resilience stood a device so fundamental that without it, thousands of rural households simply would not have endured the most arduous years of the war. During World War II, a central challenge endured by everyone was the inaccessibility of calories. Governments worldwide encouraged families to store whole grains rather than processed flour. Whole grains possess a longer shelf life, exhibit greater resistance to pests, and maintain stability through fluctuations in humidity. They represent one of the most dependable forms of long-term food security humanity has ever relied upon. However, a problem existed, so straightforward that most contemporary individuals completely overlook it. Whole grain is inedible unless it can be processed. You could possess a year's worth of calories safely stored in sacks, yet be incapable of transforming any of it into bread, porridge, or animal feed without breaking down each kernel. This is why historians frequently refer to whole grain as stored energy, or, more accurately, potential energy. It contains the nourishment necessary to sustain a family through an entire winter. Nevertheless, it is useless without a method to access it daily. This was not a minor issue. Town mills were overburdened, underpowered, or defunct. Electric grinders were uncommon, and when the grid failed, they became inert. Even manual pestles proved agonizingly slow. Families required something quicker, more robust, and designed for daily use. Without it, their entire food supply was merely a promise they couldn't actually consume. This explains why the tool we are about to examine was not merely beneficial, it was indispensable. It unlocked the sole resource everyone could still depend on: grain. In doing so, it became the pulsating core of the wartime kitchen economy. Now that the setting is established, let's finally reveal the protagonist of this narrative: the hand-cranked grain mill. Not a mere gadget, but a vital piece of infrastructure. In countless wartime kitchens, from the vast plains of Kansas to the bomb shelters of rural France, a single device was securely attached to a table, a windowsill, or even the edge of a feed bin. It wasn't gleaming. It wasn't modern. In fact, its appearance was remarkably unremarkable. Yet, it was the singular implement that transformed mere survival into a predictable daily routine: the hand-cranked grain mill. To contemporary observers, it might seem rudimentary, almost comically simple. A cast-iron frame, a rotating handle, and two steel burrs grinding against each other. However, during World War II, it transcended being just a tool. It was infrastructure, an autonomous food processing system powered exclusively by human effort. Its genius lay in its simplicity. No motor to malfunction, no belts to snap, no wiring to short-circuit during a blackout. Each revolution of the handle generated something families could utilize immediately: a coarse grind for porridge, a medium crack for livestock feed, a fine flour for daily bread. The same machine handled all these tasks because its designers understood a principle modern manufacturers frequently overlook. A survival tool must serve multiple functions, or it serves none at all. This is why wartime families place their trust in it, because when everything else failed, the mill did not. It required no spare parts, no fuel, and no electrical grid. It only needed time, grain, and the hands of the individual who relied upon it, and that rendered it invaluable. To truly grasp the significance of these mills, one must understand the underlying philosophy that guided their creation. They emerged at the conclusion of the Great Depression, were refined during World War II, and fabricated by manufacturers who recognized they could not afford to produce inferior equipment. Material scarcities, rationed metals, and overstretched factories dictated that every product had to endure for years, often decades, without requiring replacement. Consequently, their bodies were cast from thick, vibration-absorbing iron that resonated with a subdued, confident sound when tapped, affirming its density rather than any superficial construction. The burrs were crafted from hardened steel, designed not for speed, but for consistent grinding geometry. Even the adjustment screw was engineered to maintain its setting through hours of grinding without shifting. However, the true brilliance resided in its accessibility. Every surface was configured for disassembly using basic implements. A single family could clean it, mend it, or realign it without ever needing a technician. There were no sealed motors, no proprietary components, no delicate parts concealed behind plastic casings. Wartime designers presumed the user would be their own mechanic. This design philosophy, durable, transparent, repairable, is something the contemporary world desperately needs to re-embrace. Because a tool that can be completely understood by touch alone is a tool that remains with your family for generations. While many today might imagine these mills were exclusively for wheat, the reality is far more impressive. Wartime kitchens rarely enjoyed the luxury of adhering to a single grain type. Families learned to utilize whatever the land, their gardens, or the ration depot could supply. A hand-cranked mill didn't merely produce flour, it transformed corn into substantial meal, suitable for both bread and livestock. It cracked barley and rye into nutrient-rich cereal. It ground oats for warm morning porridge. As shortages worsened, families pushed even further, converting dried peas, chickpeas, beans, roasted roots, and even acorns into edible meals. Each ingredient demanded a distinct texture, and the mill provided all of them. A simple turn adjusted the gap between the steel burrs, converting a single tool into a universal food processor long before that term existed. This adaptability was not a luxury. It was a matter of survival. When the shelves were bare, families turned to their gardens, fields, and forests, and the mill converted whatever they gathered into the calories they required. For many households, it became more than just equipment. It became a pledge. As long as we have grain in this mill, we can eat tomorrow. To fully grasp the critical nature of this tool, one must visualize the entire wartime food ecosystem constructed around it. In thousands of rural homes, families did not depend on a grocery store. They relied on a system they engineered themselves, with the hand-cranked mill at its core. Whole grains were stored in galvanized steel bins or sturdy wooden barrels, sealed against moisture. These containers were not decorative. They were a form of life insurance. Inside them lay wheat, rye, barley, oats, and corn, grains that could remain edible for years as long as they stayed dry and intact. Nearby, the mill was permanently affixed to a table or workbench, ready for immediate use. No warm-up time, no setup, no fuss. A few scoops of grain, a bit of physical effort, and within minutes the family had the raw ingredients for bread, porridge, or soup. Once the grain was milled, it proceeded directly to the next stage. A wood-fired stove or a brick oven, frequently constructed by the family itself. This tripartite system, storage, processing, and cooking, operated without electricity, without fuel deliveries, and without modern conveniences. This was the wartime manifestation of self-sufficiency. Abundant grain, dedicated milling, fire, and the ability to survive the ashes. Crucially, each component functioned without relying on external utilities, allowing the entire system to operate effectively through weeks of power outages, rail disruptions, or rationing scarcity. Families who adeptly employed this setup weren't merely surviving. Many flourished relative to their neighbours, as they had effectively re-established a localized food economy within their residences. This represented resilience long before the term became commonplace. The device served as a universal food processor, a concept that predated its popularization. This adaptability was not a luxury, but a necessity for survival. When store shelves lay bare, families turned to their gardens, fields, and forests. The mill then converted their gathered provisions into the essential calories they required. For numerous households, it transcended mere equipment, becoming a solemn pledge. As long as we possess grain and this mill, we can sustain ourselves tomorrow. 8. How families selected and evaluated their mills. Selecting a mill was not a matter of chance. Families in the 1930s and 1940s operated with clear, practical criteria, understanding that they could not risk acquiring a tool prone to failure under duress. Their assessment methodology, though straightforward, proved remarkably effective. The first step was the weight assessment. A dependable wartime mill felt notably heavy for its dimensions. Properly cast and cooled iron invariably possessed a serene density. When tapped, it produced a deep, confident thud, rather than a hollow resonance. This auditory cue conveyed all necessary information to the user. This was genuine metal, not an inferior replica. Next came the movement evaluation. The adjustment mechanism ought to operate with consistent resistance, never feeling loose or sloppy. Families would rotate the handle with an empty hopper to detect any lateral instability in the main shaft. Minimal movement was acceptable, but any pronounced shaking indicated misalignment or subpar construction. Finally, they scrutinized the burr plates. Uniform wear signified enduring, consistent usage. Chipping or hairline fractures suggested stress, neglect, or flawed casting. Lightweight aluminium mills were immediately dismissed. While appearing in later decades, they were not engineered for wartime demands and would quickly degrade or deform under continuous operation. Families approached these evaluations with seriousness, as their very survival hinged on the outcome. Choosing a mill transcended a mere purchase. It was the selection of a partner in enduring hardship. 9. Proper restoration, safeguarding the cutting geometry. Upon discovering an aged mill stored in a barn, the urge for swift restoration often led to irreparable damage. Many well-intentioned individuals inadvertently ruined meticulously engineered machinery. The gravest error was attempting to polish the cutting surfaces to a brilliant sheen. Wartime burrs were not designed for smoothness. Their efficacy stemmed from microscopic ridges and angles, minute geometric features created by the machining processes of the 1930s. Sandblasting or aggressive sharpening instantly obliterated these patterns, transforming a high-performance mill into a mere decorative artifact. Correct restoration demanded considerably more patience. Rusted components were immersed in a mild acid solution, typically vinegar or citrus-based concoctions. Brass brushes were employed gently, just enough to remove oxidation without harming the underlying metal. After neutralizing the acid and thoroughly drying each part, families would process several batches of dry grain through the mill. This grain polishing naturally recalibrated the burr surfaces far more effectively than any manual intervention. External bearings received only a whisper of food-grade lubricant. internal constituents remained dry, precisely as designed. Once reassembled, the mill frequently operated with the efficiency of a device half its actual age. This meticulous approach explains why so many of these mills remain operational today. They were never fragile, merely misunderstood. 10. How this tool sustained families during the war. To truly grasp the profound significance of the hand-cranked mill, one must confront the grim realities of wartime survival. In Europe, more civilians perished from starvation and malnutrition than from direct military engagement. Even in the United States, distant from the conflict's front lines, food rationing progressively tightened its grip on families annually. Sugar, canned goods, meat, and even baking flour became intermittently available. Stores were never entirely devoid, but they were also never fully stocked. Nevertheless, whole grains, when properly stored, seldom failed. Wheat berries could endure for decades. Corn kernels retained their edibility long after modern packaged provisions expired. Yet, without a mill, these grains remained a silent, unfulfilled promise. The mill unlocked that potential. It converted unprocessed grain into the most fundamental survival provisions: bread, porridge, dumplings, hot cereal, and filler meals that extended ration coupons beyond all expectations. It enabled a family to transform a single sack of wheat into hundreds of nourishing meals. Crucially, it granted independence. Families were no longer reliant on communal mills, which were frequently overwhelmed or non-operational. They required no electricity, gas, or functional roadways. They needed no supply trucks. They demanded no authorization. In a world where every established system was collapsing, the mill provided one system that would not. It meant that survival was no longer a distant hope. It was something they could actively produce with their own hands. 11. Comparing the mill to contemporary tools and why modern equipment proves insufficient. In an era of ubiquitous ease, it's tempting to presume that contemporary tools invariably surpass anything from the 1930s. However, when juxtaposing today's kitchen appliances with a wartime mill through the lens of resilience, the disparities are almost astonishing. Electric grinders become utterly useless during a power outage. Their motors frequently overheat, their burrs rapidly dull, and their plastic housings fracture under strain. Most struggle to even process tough corn or dried beans without jamming. Food processors depend on delicate blades and fragile gears. Should one component fail, the entire apparatus becomes scrap. Modern hand mills, often fabricated from lightweight aluminium or thin metal alloys, appear appealing, but were never engineered for hours of continuous grinding. They are designed to complement a kitchen, not to sustain a family. The wartime mill, conversely, was constructed for enduring performance. It anticipated adversity. It readily processed heavy grain, grit, and endured daily application. And, because it necessitated no electricity, no replacement parts, and no maintenance beyond cleaning, it remained operational long after other implements had capitulated. When fuel reserves dwindle, when motors fail, when the lights refuse to illuminate, the most sophisticated modern technology transforms into useless bulk. Yet, a hand-cranked mill escalates in value with each passing day. This is not mere nostalgia. It is engineering that continues to outperform contemporary assumptions. 12. Survival insights from the past, the wisdom we've overlooked. Upon close examination of these antique tools, a more profound lesson emerges, one the wartime generation intuitively grasped, but that modern society frequently neglects. True resilience doesn't stem from accumulating numerous gadgets. It arises from mastering straightforward systems that function regardless of what crumbles around you. The hand mill unequivocally demonstrates this lesson. It illustrates that durability surpasses speed, that a slower, human-powered method can be more dependable than a rapid, grid-dependent one, and that a family possessing grain, fire, and a reliable mill enjoys greater food security than a contemporary kitchen brimming with electric appliances. It also instills the significance of routine. Families who utilized the mill didn't await emergencies. They ground grain every morning, forging a habit that prepared them for any eventuality. And when disruptions arose, they did not panic. They simply continued their established practices. This mindset, steadfast, tranquil, and self-sufficient, is something we can integrate into our lives today. Whether residing in a rural setting or an urban apartment, the principle remains constant. Construct systems that do not collapse when one element fails. Select tools that are repairable. Cultivate skills that endure when electricity is absent. For when all things modern abruptly cease to function, the old ways persist. 13. Conclusion. A historical artifact that continues to safeguard us today. When clasping one of these venerable mills, you are not merely gripping cast iron or hardened steel. You are holding the rationale of a generation that conquered the seemingly impossible. A generation that engineered tools not for convenience, but for continuity. Tools that performed because their operation was imperative, and because people entrusted them with their lives. Should you ever unearth one tucked away in a barn corner, forgotten in a shed, or gathering dust at an estate sale, do not simply walk past it. You are beholding a machine that sustained families when power grids faltered, when fuel vanished, and when entire nations struggled to keep their populace alive. It is a piece of wartime infrastructure, unassuming, unglamorous, yet rigorously proven under pressures more intense than most of us have ever encountered. And the truth is, its intrinsic value has not diminished. We inhabit a world still susceptible to interruptions. We depend on protracted, fragile supply chains to deliver our sustenance, our energy, our comforts. Yet, the lesson from history is straightforward. When the chain breaks, the simplest systems endure. A sack of grain, a hand mill, and a fire can nourish a family. No grid, no fuel delivery, no advanced technology required. This does not advocate abandoning modern life. It signifies comprehending the true source of security. It means reclaiming skills and instruments that lessen our dependence on systems beyond our command. It means honoring the wisdom of our predecessors, not as mere nostalgia, but as a blueprint for enduring resilience. Therefore, the next time someone suggests that preparedness originated with gadgets, generators, and battery packs, remember this. A century ago, families survived with only their hands, their routines, and a tool designed to persevere regardless of what failed around it. And if you have persevered to this point, then you understand why this matters, why history is not merely a narrative, but an invaluable guide, and understand why certain potent instruments for survival have faded from contemporary memory. Should this profound, practical, historical knowledge appeal to you, then ensure your subscription to History Prime. For our mission here extends beyond merely recounting tales from bygone eras. We safeguard the wisdom that in times past offered us protection, and it just might serve that purpose once again in the future.